I've been asked to do a lot of hard things in my life. I buried my wife. I watched my savings disappear after a medical scare that nearly took me out at 62. I raised 2 kids mostly on my own after she passed, working double shifts at a machine parts warehouse outside of Columbus, Ohio, until my knees gave out and I finally let myself retire. I know what hard looks like. I know what it costs. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what my son-in-law did on a Tuesday afternoon in November, inside the house I spent 31 years paying off. His name is Conrad. My daughter Claire met him at a work conference in Indianapolis about 6 years ago. She called me that same week, and I remember the sound of her voice, lighter than I'd heard it in years. She'd been through a rough stretch after her divorce from her first husband, and hearing her like that, I was just grateful. I didn't ask too many questions. I thought, good, she's happy. That's enough. Conrad came to Thanksgiving that first year, and I'll be honest, he made a solid first impression. Firm handshake, looked me in the eye, brought a decent bottle of red, and actually helped clear the table without being asked. My sister, June, pulled me aside in the kitchen and whispered, I like this one. I nodded and said I thought so too. We were both wrong. The first time Conrad asked me for money, it was about 18 months after the wedding. He and Claire had bought a house in Dayton. Nice place, bigger than they probably needed, but Claire loved the yard and I wasn't going to say anything. Conrad had his own landscaping business, decent-sized operation, about 8 employees. He told me he had a cash flow problem. A big commercial contract had paid late and he needed to cover payroll or he'd lose his crew. He made it sound temporary. He made it sound like he'd already explored every other option, and I was just the last resort, not the first call. I wrote him a check for $8,000. He paid it back. Not all at once, not on the timeline he promised, but over about 4 months, the full amount came back to me. I remember thinking, okay, a man who pays his debts. I can respect that. The second time was about a year later. Truck broke down, the main work truck, the one that pulled his equipment trailer. Repair estimate was $1,200, but he'd also found a used replacement truck for $6,000 that made more financial sense in the long run. He explained it all to me with the kind of detail that made it feel planned, researched. I gave him the $6,000. He never brought it up again. That should have been the sign. Not the asking, the silence afterward. A man who borrows money and then acts like it never happened isn't planning to pay you back. He's planning to wait until you forget. I didn't forget, but I didn't push either. Claire seemed happy. The house looked nice when I came to visit. I told myself the money didn't matter, that family was in a ledger. I believe that. I still do, in principle. The problem is, when only one side of the family treats it that way. By the time year 4 rolled around, Conrad had borrowed from me 3 more times, a slow winter for the business, an unexpected tax bill. He seemed genuinely blindsided by that one, almost embarrassed about it, which made me more forgiving than I should have been. Then there was the equipment loan, a new riding mower and a commercial aerator, which he insisted he'd finance separately, but then came back to me when the bank said his debt-to-income ratio was too high. Each time he had a reason. Each time, the reason was real enough that I couldn't say no without feeling like I was choosing money over my daughter's stability. The running total by that November was just under $31,000. I'm not telling you this to sound like a victim. I knew what I was doing each time. I chose to help. But I want you to understand what was at stake, what kind of history was sitting in the room that afternoon, so you understand why what happened hit me the way it did. It was a Tuesday. I'd driven up to Dayton to drop off some of Claire's things, a cedar chest that had belonged to her mother, and a box of old photos I'd finally gotten around to sorting through. Claire was at work. Conrad was home, said he was doing invoicing, which I took to mean he was watching football with his laptop open. I brought the boxes in. He helped with the cedar chest, barely, held one end up the porch steps, and then let me carry most of the weight through the door. We sat in the kitchen afterward. He made coffee, which I'll give him, and then about 10 minutes into a conversation that had been perfectly ordinary, he said he needed to talk to me about something. He needed more money. I don't remember the exact number because I stopped really listening when he said the amount. It was somewhere around $15,000. Something about expanding the business, hiring a full-time office manager, buying into a commercial contract that required upfront equipment bonding. He had papers. He actually had printed papers with him, like a presentation, which told me he'd planned this, that inviting me to bring the boxes was part of the plan. That landed somewhere in my chest and just sat there. I told him no. I said it quietly, without anger. I said I wasn't in a position to do that right now, and honestly, I said something I'd been holding for a long time. I told him I still hadn't seen anything back on what he'd borrowed before. Not accusing, just naming it. He didn't like that. He got quiet in a way that wasn't calm. He said those loans were different, that I'd always said family helps family, that I'd never once told him there was a repayment schedule. He said it the way you say something when you've rehearsed it, when you've anticipated the objection and built the defense in advance. I told him I understood his perspective. I told him I still had to say no. He stood up from the table. I thought he was going to walk away, go back to his laptop, maybe make some comment under his breath. I'd seen that kind of quiet anger before, and I knew how to let it pass. Instead, he turned around and he slapped me across the face. Not a punch, not a shove. An open-handed slap, the kind that makes a sound, the kind that's meant to humiliate more than injure. My glasses came off my face and skidded across the kitchen floor. I didn't move. I sat there in that chair and I didn't say a single word. I could feel my heartbeat in my cheek. I bent down slowly, picked up my glasses, put them back on, and looked at him. He looked scared, like he'd surprised himself. He started talking fast, something about stress, about how I didn't understand the pressure he was under, that he hadn't meant it like that. He reached out a hand and I pulled back from it, not dramatically, just back. I stood up. I thanked him for the coffee. I picked up my keys off the counter and I walked out to my truck. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before I drove away. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking, not really. I was just very still inside, the way you get when something clarifies, when the noise around a decision you've been avoiding suddenly just stops. I called my daughter that evening. I told her what had happened. She was silent for a long time, and then she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. Then I called my attorney. His name is Richard Oakes, and he's been my lawyer for about 12 years, handled my will, the refinancing on my house, a property dispute with a neighbor a few years back. Not a dramatic man, not flashy. Exactly the kind of person you want on your side when things get real. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and then he said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." Over the next 3 weeks, I gathered everything I had, bank statements showing every transfer, the text messages where Conrad had asked for money. I'd saved them not because I expected trouble, but because I'm organized by habit. An email chain from the second loan where he'd confirmed the amount and promised a repayment timeline. Richard also connected me with a colleague, a family law attorney named Patricia Slade, who specialized in this kind of civil matter. Here's the thing about not confronting someone right away. When you stay quiet, when you don't blow up and make accusations and send angry texts, they think they've gotten away with it. Conrad called me once in those 3 weeks, left a voicemail that was about 80% apology and 20% explanation. I didn't call back. He texted twice. I didn't respond. Claire told me he'd convinced himself I was just cooling off. On a Thursday morning 3 weeks after that Tuesday in November, I drove back up to Dayton. Conrad was home. I'd timed it that way. Claire was at work, and I'd told her I was coming, told her she didn't need to be there, that this was something I had to do on my own. He opened the door and looked surprised, the kind of surprise that has guilt underneath it. He started to say something with the word "look" at the front of it, which is how people begin sentences they've been rehearsing. I handed him the envelope. It was a standard white envelope. The kind you pick up in a pack of 50 at CVS. His name on the front in my handwriting. I'd sealed it. He looked at it. Then he looked at me, and I'll tell you, I saw it on his face. The hope, because I was standing there calm and quiet, not angry, and I'd driven all the way up with an envelope in my hand, and he'd been waiting 3 weeks, and his brain did exactly what I expected it to do. He thought it was a check. He thought I'd thought it over and decided that keeping the peace with my daughter was worth more than my pride. He almost smiled. He said, "I really think we can move forward from this, Walter." And then he caught himself using my name wrong, called me by the wrong name entirely, and I realized in that moment just how nervous he actually was underneath all of it. He opened the envelope. Inside was a civil demand letter, prepared by Richard and Patricia's office, formally documenting every loan, dates, amounts, any written communication, and stating that the full amount of $31,200 was being called in as a debt. There was also a separate document, a formal report of the assault I'd filed with the Columbus County Sheriff's Department the week before, and a letter from Patricia indicating she was prepared to pursue civil battery charges in addition to the debt claim if the matter wasn't resolved within 30 days. He read the first page, then he stopped. Then he sat down on his porch step. He didn't faint. I want to be accurate here. He didn't dramatically collapse. What he did was sit down very slowly, like his legs made the decision before his brain did, and he put both hands flat on his knees and stared at the papers for a long moment. When he looked up at me, his face had gone a color I don't have a word for. He said, "You serious?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Claire knows about this." I said, "My daughter and I have discussed it, yes." He opened his mouth again, and I raised one hand, not in anger, not a gesture that meant anything aggressive, just a hand raised that said, "I'm done with this part of the conversation." I turned and walked back to my truck. Claire called me that afternoon. She'd gone home early from work. Conrad had called her, apparently in something close to a panic. She told me she wasn't angry with me. She said that was the part she needed me to know first. She was scared and she was overwhelmed, and she didn't know what it meant for her marriage. But she told me she wasn't angry with me. She said, "He told me those other loans were just gifts. He told me you were fine with it." I told her to go back and look at her bank account. I told her I thought she'd find some deposits over the past 4 years that might help her understand what was actually happening with their finances. She called me back 2 hours later. She'd been crying. Some of that money her husband had been borrowing from her father to float a business while drawing his own salary and keeping her from seeing the full books. She'd had no idea. That's the part that still makes me the angriest. Not the slap, not even the money. It's that he used me to deceive her. The civil matter resolved about 3 months later. Conrad didn't have $31,000 liquid, unsurprising, given everything, but his attorney negotiated a structured repayment plan, and his homeowner's insurance covered part of it through a liability provision that Patricia identified. The assault filing was resolved through a deferred prosecution agreement that required him to complete an anger management program and remain incident-free for 18 months. It's not what some people would have wanted. Some people would have wanted blood. I understand that. I just wanted the truth documented somewhere official, where it couldn't be rewritten or minimized later. Claire left him 4 months after that November. She moved back to Columbus, found a rental not 15 minutes from me, and started over. She was 41 years old and starting over, and she did it without complaint, which is one of the bravest things I've ever watched. She's doing okay now. Better than okay, honestly. She joined a grief support group at her church, which I think surprised her because she's not a deeply religious person, but she said the community part helped more than the spiritual part, and either way, I don't care about the reasons. She came to dinner last Sunday, and she looked rested in a way she hadn't looked in years. She asked me once, a few months after everything settled, why I hadn't just called the police that day in the kitchen, why I'd driven home and sat on it for 3 weeks. I told her the truth. I told her that in that moment, sitting there in her kitchen with my cheeks stinging and my glasses on the floor, my first thought wasn't about Conrad at all. It was about her. I didn't want to blow her life up in a moment of anger. I wanted to do it carefully, if it needed to be done. I wanted the decision to hold up, to mean something, to not be something either of us could look back on and question. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you waited." I've thought about that envelope a lot since then, about what it felt like to hand it to him. There was no satisfaction in it. Not exactly. That's not quite the word. It was more like resolution, like a door closing on something that had been left open too long, letting cold air into the house. A man who hits someone he should be protecting isn't a man who's under pressure. He's a man who's been getting away with things for a long time and ran out of room. The pressure is just a moment when the room runs out. I don't know if Conrad learned anything. I genuinely don't know, and I've stopped spending energy trying to figure it out. What I know is that my daughter is 15 minutes away and she came to dinner last Sunday and she looked rested. That's enough for me. I've had a long time to think about that Tuesday, about the kitchen, the coffee going cold on the counter, the sound my glasses made sliding across the tile floor. People ask me sometimes, usually with a kind of hungry look, like they want me to say something satisfying, whether I feel like I won. I never know how to answer that, because winning wasn't really the point. The point was stopping something before it became permanent. Conrad didn't become the man who hit his father-in-law in a single afternoon. That's what I want people to understand. He became that man slowly, over years of small choices, borrowing without intending to repay, lying without feeling the cost of it, taking and taking until the taking felt normal, and any resistance felt like an attack. By the time he raised his hand to me, he'd already been telling himself for years that the rules didn't quite apply to him the way they applied to everyone else. The slap wasn't an explosion. It was the logical end of a long, quiet erosion. That's the thing about character. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Every time Conrad borrowed money and reframed it as something I'd offered freely, something shifted in him. Every time he kept Claire from seeing the full picture of their finances, something else shifted. By the time I was sitting across that kitchen table from him, I wasn't dealing with a man who'd made one bad decision under pressure. I was dealing with the result of 100 small decisions, each one just slightly worse than the one before. I'm not saying this to condemn him. I'm saying it because I think it's the most useful truth in this whole story. The envelope I handed him 3 weeks later wasn't revenge. It was a mirror. It was documentation. Legal, official, permanent, of choices he'd made over a long period of time, finally organized into something he couldn't reframe or minimize or charm his way around. That's what made him sit down on that porch step. Not the dollar amount, not the legal language, the fact that it was all written down. What I'm most proud of, if proud is even the right word, is that I waited. I sat in that driveway for a few minutes and I let the anger be what it was, and then I drove home and I thought about my daughter, not about what I wanted to do, but what would actually help her. That distinction took me a long time to learn. I'm 63 years old and I'm still learning it. But I know this, the decisions that hold up over time are almost never the ones you make in the first 10 minutes after you've been hurt. Claire is 15 minutes away now. She looked rested at dinner last Sunday. That's the whole ledger as far as I'm concerned. Not the repayment plan, not the deferred prosecution, not any of it. Just my daughter, 15 minutes away, looking like herself again. If there's anything worth taking from what happened to us, it's this. The truth has a way of staying true whether or not anyone acknowledges it. You can document it quietly and let it sit. You can be patient. You don't have to blow anything up to make things right. You just have to be willing to be clear-eyed about what's actually happening and then act from that clarity instead of from the hurt. That's harder than it sounds, but it's the only way I know to do something that lasts.